roundtable discussion on the newly introduced Online News Act. I am Supriya Dwivedi, the Director of Policy and Engagement here at the Center, and I will be your moderator for today's roundtable. Before I get to introducing our stellar panel of experts we have assembled for you here today, allow me to just set the stage a little. Introduced in the House last week, the Online News Act seeks to regulate digital platforms to achieve the three following things: enhance fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace, establish a framework through which digital platforms and news outlets in Canada may enter into financial agreements on news content that is made available through those digital platforms, and lastly, contribute to the sustainability of the media sector in Canada as a whole. While the Act is just over a week old, it has been in the making for quite some time now. In the 2020 speech from the throne, as well as in the 2021 mandate letter for the Minister of Heritage, the government had been clear about its intent to establish a new legislative and regulatory framework that would ensure the revenues of tech platforms such as Facebook and Google are shared with Canadian news media in order to bolster Canadian journalism. And of course, it didn't exactly hurt that the industry itself has been lobbying for something like this for the last few years, and it's not really hard to see why once we start to factor in some numbers. According to figures by the Ministry of Heritage, the combined losses for television, radio, newspapers, and magazines over the last 12 years comes in at just under $5 billion. Additionally, at least a third of Canadian journalism jobs have just disappeared since 2010. And lastly, from 2008 to August 2021, nearly 450 news outlets have closed, with 63 of those closures happening since the pandemic. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to the Act itself, but one thing is patently clear when talking about all of this. Journalism serves an integral purpose in a free and democratic society. Democracy and journalism have this almost mutualistic, symbiotic relationship in that one can't really survive without the other. Attempting to ensure the survival of public interest journalism is a laudable goal, and Canada isn't the only place that realizes this. Other jurisdictions have been grappling with these issues as well. Journalism isn't only dying in Canada, after all, it's happening all over the world, and other countries have put forward their own solutions. In fact, the press release for the announcement of the Online News Act makes specific mention of similar legislation that has been passed in Australia. So, with all that said, let's dive into the details of the Online News Act and talk about where Canada's approach to this fits into the larger global suite of policies that have attempted to deal with all of this. Allow me to introduce our panelists for today. First, we've got Bill Grueskin, a professor of professional practice at Columbia Journalism School. Next, we've got Edward Greenspon, president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Jessica Johnson is editor-in-chief of the Walrus. Taylor Owen is my boss and director of the Center for the Media Technology and Democracy. Rachel Pulfer is executive director for Journalists for Human Rights. Anya Schiffrin is director of the Technology, Media, and Communications at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And David Skok is CEO and editor-in-chief at The Logic. All right, let's get into it. Bill, I'm gonna pick on you first, simply because I mentioned Australia in my intro, and you've spent a ton of time studying this from the Australia lens. And it's interesting because it had a bunch of criticisms, and one of the biggest and most persistent criticisms of the Australian model was that it was almost entirely opaque and secretive by design. But what were some of your key takeaways for you when looking at this through the Australian lens?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to see so much interest in this. Canada's bill, as you noticed, Supriya, is closely modeled on Australia's, and in many ways, I think we can say that Australia's bill has been quite successful. It's delivered around $200 million in just a year, Australian dollars, which are about the same as Canadian dollars, to news organizations, big ones like Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and much smaller, daily and weekly newspapers. And as a result, there's a lot of hiring going on in Australian journalism. Some small publications are complaining that their people are getting poached by bigger ones because there's so much money sloshing around, which all sounds great, and in many ways it is. But all that said, as you noted, it's an incredibly opaque system. Every one of these deals between Facebook and Google and any news organization is wrapped up in a very strict non-disclosure agreement. And as I said in my piece in Columbia Journalism Review, I've been talking to newsroom managers all my life, and I've never seen any group of people who are so hesitant to talk about something that everybody knows about. And we do have pretty good information on some of them. We know that Rupert Murdoch's News Corp got well over $50 million a year, which includes some other contracts. I've actually seen the contract for small papers. They're getting anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 a year just from Google alone. But if you want to know exactly, well, actually, there's kind of three main areas of opacity here. The first one is we don't know what criteria Google and Facebook are using to cut these deals. Richard Gingras in a YouTube video, vice president for news at Google, said in a forum here in Canada a couple of months ago that it was based on a lot of things, but chiefly scale, and chiefly the number of stories a website puts out every day, which creates a lot of incentives, not all of them good for journalism. But we don't know exactly what criteria they use to decide how much they pay. We also don't know what criteria they use to decide we're going to pay news organization X and not news organization Y. The most inexplicable one in Australia is that Facebook did make a deal with the ABC, which is the largest public broadcaster in Australia, but they refused to do one with the SBS, which is somewhat smaller, but still quite significant. It appeals to multicultural and multilingual audiences. And they didn't give an explanation. They just, and as somebody told me, Facebook at a certain point just decided, we're just not going to pay anybody anymore. So A, we don't know what the criteria are. B, we don't know how much money each news organization is getting. And C, we don't know how these news organizations are really spending the money. Only the ABC and a few others have been very transparent about it. We have no idea whether it's being used to hire new journalists or to pad executive salaries. And you can wonder, why does that matter? And what a lot of publishers told me when I was there was, look, this is a private commercial deal being done between two companies, no different than some advertiser buying a bunch of ads in the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age in Melbourne. And that's sort of true, but it's kind of missing the point, because these are commercial deals that are being done under the coercion of the federal government of Australia. And everybody, Facebook and Google, government officials and media executives all agree these deals wouldn't be happening if the Australian government hadn't passed a law just a little over a year ago, what's called the News Media Bargaining Code, which basically forces them to do these deals or raise the risk of going to what's called baseball arbitration. So, it's clearly been quite successful in some ways. And if you talk to people in the government, Rod Sims, who was the chief regulator who got this passed, or Josh Frydenberg, who's the treasurer of Australia, who has the ultimate power to decide whether to force these companies into arbitration, they will say, look, 90% of journalists, and this is their claim, I don't know, it's impossible to back up, but 90% of journalists work for news organizations that are getting money from Facebook, Google, or both. And that may well be true. And a lot of small publishers are as happy about this as big ones like News Corp and Nine, but we don't really know. And that causes a lot of concerns, especially among those publishers who are not getting money, are not getting as much as they thought they should, and ultimately for the public that each of those serve.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit and focus a little bit on the Canadian angle here. Jessica, you've reported quite a bit on the state of journalism in Canada, and you wrote a great feature back in December for the Walrus. It was, blowing up my feed from every single journalist I follow on there, basically just, on how dire the situation is right now and, what can be done going forward. From your vantage point, does the Online News Act get to some of the core of the concerns that you raised in your piece?
It really does. And thanks for saying that about my story. It's a start. It's important to recognize this is not a magic bullet that will save an industry. It probably won't save even a single outlet. It's a piece of a puzzle. There's a few things that need to happen for us to really turn around the story of the media. The media needs to raise its own money better. The public probably needs to be more accustomed to paying for content. But this government regulation piece is something we've been wanting for a long time. It would have been nice to have it 10 years ago, and it is a start. The thing I wanted to say too, for anyone who's just joining and is like, why are we even talking about this? So platforms boost engagement and get users because they have really great content. We, the media, make a lot of that content. We don't currently get financially compensated for it. So what this does is mean that when someone shares a piece of our content, we would be getting some financial compensation, amounts to be determined. And I think that's why we're all having this very spicy conversation around it.
David, your views have been particularly interesting on the state of journalism in this country, as well as, the proposed solutions that are out there to help fix it. Originally, you were somewhat opposed to the government going forward with something like Australia has done, but my understanding is that your position has evolved. Would you mind just detailing for us, I guess, how you came to your position now and what was really, explaining your reasoning for your change of mind?
Sure, I'm happy to twist myself in a pretzel for you. It's my position actually hasn't evolved. In many ways, I am still against any form of subsidy for journalism that, whether it's QCJO, which is the government subsidy that was put in place, or the government tax credit several years ago, or this Online News Act. My view is on all of this that it distorts the market in ways that stifle the very innovation that we all so desperately need in this country when it comes to journalism. The problem with principled states, I still believe, is that the reality is things are happening around us. I kind of view the logic, which is a startup that we began in 2018 with 3 people and $300,000 in seed funding, and now we're a national newsroom with 20 people and 6 bureaus. We are that innovation that you hope to have in this ecosystem. And what's happening is all of this other stuff around us is distorting the market and making it very challenging for us to continue to grow, or puts competitive pressures on us that we didn't face before. And I had been warning about that at the very beginning. When I wrote, as soon as the QCJO came out, I said, it happened. And I never thought I would have to take it, but I have to take it because I have a fiduciary duty to my shareholders to be able to compete on a level playing field for talent, for stories and everything else. And so when you have these deals, and as Bill articulated, that are opaque in many ways, and I'm sure we'll get into it more, but when you have these deals that don't allow you to see what's really happening in a fair and relatively equal manner, it distorts the ability for any new startups to thrive in this ecosystem. So my whole emphasis in all of this is that you need journalism innovation in this country. And in order to have that journalism innovation thrive, you need essentially a level playing field to allow all of us to grow. And I'm not sure, even to this day, whether any of this helps that happen. The one rub in all of this is, I've seen a lot of conversation over the last few days since the legislation was proposed that's basically treating this as if it's the start of the process. And I think, as Jessica pointed out, we're actually at the end of the process. These deals are already happening. And I've watched it happen. I've had, in our world, dealing in a competitive media ecosystem, we're already seeing the impacts of these deals on our teams. And so this is not the beginning of the process. This is actually the end. I didn't want it. I still don't want it, but I don't feel like we have a choice, because really at this stage, it's already happening with or without government involvement. And government's involvement at this point is to try to create that equal playing field, as opposed to let the distortion continue to happen around us.
Rachel, so much of what has been lost in recent years when it comes to journalism is, substantive, independent, local or community-oriented journalism. And, David touched on this a little bit in terms of smaller news outlets. But where do smaller news outlets or, nonprofit news organizations, where do they sort of fit into all of this?
It's a great question, Supriya. Thank you. So one of the questions I've been struggling with in conversations with many of those on this panel is such intervention needed? To David's point, many both legacy and digital entities have made deals already with platforms. They're not deals that offer the game-changing hundreds of millions of dollars, massive transfer of wealth from platforms to news, to be sure, but they are deals that have helped to incent new innovations in the delivery of news to Canadians. It's also true to say that we have seen a flowering of digital media startups in Canada, such as David's with The Logic, The Narwhal, Village Media, National Observer. At the risk of limiting my employment prospects when I eventually leave JHR for journalism again, I'd argue the community-driven and supported digital startup space is where the real excitement and energy is in Canadian media currently. It's the future. I wouldn't go so far to say this is currently sustainable, but it is an exciting moment for digital news, and it would be a real shame if this legislation squashed that in some way. I would argue, having watched how some of those deals have been made, that there is a need for collective bargaining and there is a need for transparency. I don't think there is a need for the CRTC to be the all-powerful decider of who gets to come to the table. That is one aspect of this legislation that I find quite concerning. I'm also going to quibble with this legislation when it comes to the notion that it's going to necessarily work, because news is not profitable for Facebook, Google, and other platforms. It's not profitable. They tweak the algorithm sometimes in order to benefit news, because news wants exposure. What's profitable is the viral sludge of disinformation and vapidity and hate speech and incendiary content that drives eyeballs and engagement. That is what is profitable. And what concerns me about this legislation is that it does not in any way, as far as I can tell, address the core issue, which is that these business models profit massively off of the sharing of this kind of bad information. And there is actually in this legislation built in a financial disincentive to share news. If you have to pay for every link you share, if you have to pay for every news story you share, then the incentive is to not share them. Why not flip it on its head and have a financial disincentive to share hate speech or to share the toxic sludge that so many of these platforms profit from? And that's a question that I'd be very curious to hear responses from others on the community in this panel. But it's an interesting step. But I worry that with the CRTC playing the opaque, all-powerful decider of who gets to come to the table role that it seems to be ascribed, we're asking for trouble in a scenario where, imagine a situation where, dial forward 5 years, we have a demagogic populist leader in the federal government, and they decide to tell the CRTC what to do when it comes to figuring out who gets to come to these tables and have these deals or not. And I think that those are very, very real concerns that this legislation doesn't have good answers for. Thank you.
Anya, you've been doing a ton of work on the various approaches that have been used around the world when it comes to trying to save journalism, or at least, ensure that it has better funding. How does the Online News Act in Canada sort of fit into the broader suite of policy approaches that we've seen around the world? And, I guess my immediate follow-up question is, are we doing a good job? Is our first go at this, are we striking the right sort of balance?
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I just want to say, I guess we started writing about this with my students and in our first report in November 2020. And it's been super interesting to watch our thinking, everyone's thinking evolve. Just after the bill was passed in Australia, Taylor and I at your center, we organized competition ministers from all over the world. And do you remember, Taylor, and many of you were on that Zoom, and we said to them, are you going to copy Australia or not? And the South Africans said, and the Brits and the Canadians said, we're going to try. And the Europeans said, we can't because we're following EU copyright directive. So it's very interesting that a year later, Canada has actually done this. I think I'm learning a lot from what David is writing about. And I think it's super interesting how people, and Ed as well, are updating their ideas. I feel like when Australia first proposed this, there was a kind of reflexive critique of the bill. And I know Taylor and I felt that was actually, unwarranted. I think that David's point that, I guess I take maybe a more pragmatic view of a lot of this, which is where it's an emergency, all hands on deck. There's so many things that need to be done. We're never going to be able to design Trump-proof policies. and around the world, what I hear in places like Latin America is we're not Sweden. We don't want any government money. We don't want even a tax credit from the government because we're not Sweden and it can be misused. But the fact is, as David has pointed out, a startup is really, they fail all the time. It's incredibly hard to be a startup. And so lots and lots of startups do end up taking money from Google or Facebook or foundations. So that's the reality. So I think in terms of regulation, what we need to look at is sort of what can you get past? What fits with your sort of culture and society and regulators, and what will do the least harm? So what we're seeing around the world is a whole range of things. So Indonesia and Tunisia tried what Canada's tried, which are tax credits for for hiring reporters, for subscriptions. We've seen vouchers, which I think Canada tried. And I think we should probably do like a separate Zoom just on whether vouchers work. The early evidence at Seattle as well is that they really weren't very successful. And they didn't actually, that turns out price elasticity is not really the determinant variable of news consumption. So I think what I'm seeing around the world is kind of a suite of ideas, vouchers, tax credits, these kinds of bills. Senegal and South Africa, both in 2021, said they were interested in copying the Australian bill. They haven't done it. Interestingly, Brazil was supposed to vote on it this week. And according to my colleague, the Brazilian journalist Patricia Campos, she sent me a fascinating email that Google and Facebook killed it. They managed to get Bolsonaro on their side, and it was supposed to be voted a couple days ago, and they killed it. And she calls this an unlikely alliance between the internet platforms and the Bolsonaro administration, and a huge victory for Google and Facebook's aggressive lobbying efforts against the payment for news content. So I've asked Patricia if you could please write something. Hopefully she'll be writing this up for Pointer. I know, fascinating. So this is evolving every minute. New things are being tried all over the place. How many of them stick? I don't know. I agree that we've got huge problems, and it's going to be tough to solve them. But I think I think we have to accept some sort of government intervention where we can get it, and there'll be lots of places where we can't. Lots of many countries in Africa have just said no, we're not paying for news. And then I guess my last final thought is that it's so clear that these big companies need to be paying tax revenue. To me, like what would the ideal solution would be? It would be like massive tax revenue from Google and Facebook and Amazon, and then allocated in a fair way. And again, I know we're not Sweden. I know not everything can be done perfectly, but there are plenty of countries in Scandinavia and France, that do have ways of allocating. And the other thing I guess I'll say is, if a few dinosaurs get propped up, it ain't the end of the world as well. So no system will be perfect, but I think it's important to try to do something. Anyway, thanks so much. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, not at all.
Listening to you all.
Ed, let's turn to you now. I mean, a lot of, what has been said is talking about just the state of journalism more generally. And I guess my question to you would be, how does the state of journalism become impacted, either negatively or positively, if a large chunk of its revenues are coming from, government and or tech platforms?
Yeah, well, obviously, that's not ideal because it's not so much where they come from, it's how much of it comes from those places, in a sense. I mean, obviously, there's always been government advertising. You want a diversification of your revenues, and you always want a diversification of your revenues. I mean, people used to worry that advertisers exercised undue influence on editorial decisions, which was very, very rare, but not unheard of, certainly. But no advertiser made up % or 1% of revenues, or even Bill and I worked at Bloomberg. No, customer of Bloomberg's made up much more than that on basically a pay well model, $24,000 per subscription. So what I worry about that concentration, and I think I worry about them separately, in a sense, government and platforms. And if I just run through that for a second, I mean, from the beginning. And the beginning for me, was a study in the Shattered Mirror, which started 6 years ago and published 5 years ago. And in there, we were concerned that where is money going to come from, to Anya's point? There is an emergency, and there seemed three possibilities perhaps to us. That was going to come from financing journalism, going to come from, if the marketplace was not working, benevolent billionaires who are, which is not an oxymoron, but in short supply, benevolent billionaires. It was going to come from philanthropy, which is much more robust in the United States, certainly, than it is in Canada, or it was going to come from public money. And if it was going to come from public money, that crosses a classic axis of the role of the press for government. So we needed to design systems that had the briefest and lightest touches possible. And that's what we tried to do in, to the people here who are in favor of a tech tax. Essentially, that's what we proposed, was a levy similar to the cable levy. For those of you who aren't Canadian, Canada charges a 5% levy on cable and satellite companies, and that money is then recycled into production. So it would be a levy from the distributors into the producers. So that's not what happened. Instead, we get to an Australian model. Now, we also have, the Australian model shouldn't be decontextualized from the packages of policies that already exist, including the labor tax credit, which is the biggest of those. And nonetheless, the Australian model then presents its own problem. So keeping the government, arm's length, et cetera, critical. I'm worried about that. I want to be attentive to that, but I'm not discombobulated by that. We've had a CBC for many years that seems to have performed fairly good independent journalism. Now I'm really worried, though, about the tech side, because, if they are going to provide 30% of editorial costs, which is the upper limit that people have seen in Australia, that's a lot of money. That's more than any advertiser ever provided. That's probably anywhere between 5 and 10% of the total revenues of a news organization, which is huge. And I don't want them to have discretion. So the system isn't complete discretion. It'll be 5-year deals or whatever it will be, but it's worrisome. And so then, what are the antidotes to that? And I think we've heard a number of antidotes already. Bill discusses them in his paper. David referred to a couple. We did a paper recently and we said, look, why don't we just treat everybody in the collective, everybody who qualifies as a news organization, the same. If it's going to be 30% for one, it's 30% for all. If it's going to be 25%, it'll be 25%. So equal treatment would be one antidote. That isn't the way people want it to go in a market-based, which is a fiction. Everything has semi-fiction to it, but a market-based system. So maybe there should be a range then, nobody should be treated worse, 50% worse than anybody else or something. That would be, you could still have market elements in a regulated system. Transparency, though, if those don't work, transparency, which I think we all probably want to talk about, is the next critical thing. Transparency is pro-market. Transparency is not anti-market. The whole idea of markets working well, and again, I go back to Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg's idea of, was based on let's have transparent bond markets so that people can make more informed decisions. So it's important to me who operates here, a news organization. Jessica is an editor. David is a publisher, and it's important to me that the Walrus and the Logic know what is the market price out there. If they get offered 2% and they have no idea what the market price is, then they don't know if they're being discriminated against by platforms that may not like them because of the journalism they do. And I, as a consumer, want to know if they're being favored and then judge them on that basis. So transparency is quite critical. Transparency can also be self-produced and self-regulated. News organizations are calling for transparency at everybody and everything always. That's, one of the great bases of news, and they should not sign NDAs. They should just not sign NDAs. They have that capacity, and they have the capacity for every one of them to disclose, what they're doing. if they stand together, and they have stood together. And the final piece I'd just say is that David made the point, and I won't go into it now, but innovation and competition are important and key components also to having a system that will be open and fair, in which the platforms will not be able to pick winners and losers, which is something we should all be concerned about.
Taylor, there's a lot that has been already touched on here, and Ed sort of got into it a little bit in his answer, but in terms of like how Canada really builds on the Australian model, like have we improved? Is this a good evolution? Is it do you see it as a terrible evolution? Did we miss the mark completely? Like, because we're not first out of the gate, we kind of had that benefit, but I'm just wondering from your vantage point, like how does Canada really build on Australia's model?
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to that. Let me just build on a couple of things that have been said. I mean, one is, Rachel, I think a lot of this turns on whether I agree with you, whether you think journalism is a market failure that can be corrected with policies that influence the market, or is a systemic market failure that requires some sort of public option or subsidy in some more lasting, permanent way. And part of that depends on where you see, I think, journalism value in society, right? Like, is it something that's required for a democratic society and therefore shouldn't be held to the whims of the market? And if you think the market can provide that or not. So like, there's some big questions there. And I think it's worth remembering that last year, the Canadian government had two potential scenarios they were looking at. This is after the subsidy, the tax credit. Their next phase of their support was two options. One, the Australian model, which I would argue is more of a kind of market mechanism that believes there's some market failure that can be corrected by shifting the incentives a little bit between players in the market, the publishers and the platforms. But their other option was the collective fund idea. So a dedicated tax, or either a dedicated tax or from general revenue, going to a common fund that would then be distributed amongst publishers in sort of an arm's length way. And they did a consultation on that. And they decided to go the bargaining code way. Now, my personal view is I prefer the fund route, for a whole host of reasons that we can get into. So that on the table, like I think that's a more sustainable model, in part because I believe in the systemic market failure and core to democracy side of this. So I think where you come at this really plays a role in where you end up in terms of these policy solutions. Now, I can understand why they thought there was real risk in going that route. There was already challenge in deciding who was going to get the labor tax credit. There was already a lot of critique about who was going to be included and not, how those decisions were going to be made. Now, you can imagine the difficulty and challenges of setting up a national fund to support all journalism in Canada. I mean, the logistics of that are difficult. So I recognize that. But I think the payoff is probably worth it. Anyways, all that is said. Second thing I would say is, to Anya's point, is that this is clearly part of a much bigger journalism landscape, policy landscape, both in Canada and internationally. And part of the benefit of this broad policy space, the digital policy space generally, not just for journalism, is that countries are experimenting around the world. And we now increasingly have empirical evidence of what's working and not in other jurisdictions. This is true of online harms regulation, of data privacy regulation, and also of journalism policy. So I think the question now is, if we are going down this Australian route, are we taking the right lessons and evolving sufficiently to correct for some of the problems that many people on this call have flagged just to the Australian model, right? And there, I would just say a few things. I mean, Ed sort of touched on these a bit, but one, it's the exemption criteria need to be really clear, and you can do a lot of work with those exemption criteria. That's your real lever here for how you're changing the journalism market and what kind of journalism you're incentivizing via these deals. So those criteria are really important. And there are 6 of them in this bill. And so I think we should talk about which ones are good and which ones are bad, which ones are opaque, which ones should be specified more. And I imagine when this goes through the committee process, those exemption criteria are going to be the focus of a ton of debate, and should be, because they're really powerful. The second is that in Australia, past deals were kind of just wrapped up in this. So no one's ever been designated because everyone kind of cut a deal already. And here, that to me is a meaningful evolution, is that past deals will have to go through that same exemption criteria. So all these deals that were cut with some publishers and not others in Canada, as David can speak to better than anybody in this call, are going to have to go through that same criteria. And I actually think that's really important because it resets the baseline for all the deals that are going to be done, and make, if part of the goal is market fairness, then that's really important. The final thing is just on transparency. I mean, I'm totally with Bill and Ed on this. I think it needs to be radically more transparent. I understand there's concerns about influencing a fair market and whether there's charter issues there or not. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But it seems to me like if you're not making all the terms of these deals transparent and you're relying on a regulator to disclose the terms of the deals in a either anonymized or aggregate way, you need to specify in detail what needs to be included in those. I don't think you can leave that to future regulators to decide what's going to be made transparent in that reporting or not. And the idea of this being sort of an annual aggregated report, I don't think helps publishers as they start to make deals in the first year of these. There's going to be a flurry of deals in the first year. And if I'm a small publisher, I kind of want to know what other deals are being made. And I can't wait a year to know that. Like, that's really important market information for me. So it seems to me, at least in that first year or two, there should be really quick feedback loops of that disclosure, even if it is in some aggregate way. And the final thing is just on those NDAs. Like, I don't know what the lever is to stop those NDAs, but they are super problematic here. I totally agree with Ed there, that the idea that these deals are sitting behind NDAs is just pernicious. And it's not just a problem for journalism, it's a much bigger problem. But if we can do something about that through this, I don't know how, it seems to me that's a positive outcome. So I'll leave it there.
I wanted to move more into like a bit of an open discussion before we get into questions from the audience, which, by the way, you can put into the chat, and then I'll get to them. But there's one thing I wanted to pick up, and Rachel, you touched on this, and it keeps coming up as one of the biggest criticisms of the act, which is that the legislation is effectively a link tax, in that it will, fundamentally change the way everyone uses the internet, or at least, social media. So, I mean, David, why don't you start us off here? Is this a link tax, and is it going to screw up the way everyone uses the internet here?
Yeah, I think that argument is absolutely ridiculous, quite frankly. I don't have another way of putting it. The open web and the idea of the open web, I love the idea and the democratization of the internet as much as anybody, but these are private company or public companies with public shareholders and corporate interests. And they have created and set up walled gardens for a long time now. And I mean, even just today, if you look, Elon Musk is trying to buy one of these companies. And the notion that, and again, as Taylor said, the criteria upon which you get then chosen, if I'm understanding it correctly, to be involved in all of this is quite high. It's a high threshold. These are not companies that are supportive of an open web, no matter what they say. They are private companies creating walled gardens. And so this is about making sure that their market dominance is more equitable for others to be able to play in that space. I mean, you see it, some of the reporting that was done by Martin Patriquin, our reporter at The Logic, demonstrated the fear that some publishers have of even speaking out publicly about the idea of, if they do this on, if they complain about the licensing, well, that's going to impact their bidding on advertising. I mean, there is no open web here. And I think that argument needs to be zoomed out a little bit more than just a link tax. The other thing I just want to pick up on Taylor's point about the transparency, it's not just the licensing revenue or the deals themselves. I think we also should think about, it's a bit of whack-a-mole here, where it is not beyond the pale for these platforms or other publishers to sign deals that are perhaps, Google News Showcase in one part, but also advertising or programmatic credits or other credits. And I don't think the Act, as currently constructed, considers the fact that these deals may have multiple elements to them. And this is just looking at that one particular part of it. So just again, zooming out on this, we have to be mindful that there's still a very clear way for publishers and platforms to work around some of these agreements.
Rachel, I see you nodding, and I noted that you were taking a couple of notes there. Do you want to get in on that?
Yes. So just jumping off of the question about the taxing the sharing of news links. So I guess there's 19 million Canadians on Facebook. There's 1.4 million Canadians who watch our most watched national broadcast news show, CTV News. Canadians have already voted as to where they want to get information from, and they've voted very decisively. And I think that what that has created for our democracy is a situation where 19 million Canadians are exposed to bad information all the time. And we are going to start to see the poor democratic and national security outcomes that come from that situation very soon, very soon. And as a result of that, one of the things that's been preoccupying me through this conversation is, instead of taxing, I do think that it creates a financial disincentive for the platforms to share news. And I think that that is a major problem and an unintended consequence, but it will be a consequence of this legislation. So instead of going that route, why not tax the bad content? We talk about a price on carbon. Why not put a price on information pollution? So that when something goes viral, because it is gross or nasty or snarky or bitchy or hateful, there is a tax hit to the platform that then accrues back to the news publishers. And so I just want to put that out there, because what frustrates me about this legislation, so much of this conversation, is it does not get at why these platforms are so colossally financially successful, which is that as human beings, we like to share stuff that is not good for us. And we are starting to see the impact of that in our democracy, in democratic outcomes.
Rachel, I was wondering what you think of the free press proposal to tax micro-targeting and use the money for journalism. I think they launched it a few years ago, and I don't know that it's had much traction. I was wondering if it's similar to what maybe somebody could put the link to the report in the chat, but I don't know, Rachel, if you talk to them or what you think of that. Is it similar to what you're proposing?
I'm not too familiar with the proposal, so I'm not in a position to comment on that. But what I do want to bring this conversation to is, instead of dancing around the core issue, let's address the core issue. These organizations are financially incented to share bad information. Let's put a price on that bad information. The highest price could be on the sharing of violent hate speech, which currently happens with impunity on Facebook and elsewhere. And that those revenues then go back to support good quality news organizations like the ones represented on this call. And thinking about it that way, rather than thinking about the paying for content piece, because the content doesn't make the platforms money. It doesn't. And so there's a financial disincentive layered on the fact that people don't engage with quality news at the moment. And we don't, unfortunately, unlike Finland and Estonia, we do not have a media literacy program that starts in kindergarten, goes through to university, telling people that as a function of being part of a liberal democracy, please be informed. We don't have those principles in our culture. And so people are going to share cat videos, and they're going to share Britney's baby, and they're going to share Russian disinformation without realizing it. And so, for example, if there's a disinformation campaign breaking on social media, then that can be monitored. And if lots and lots and lots and lots of people are sharing virally information and abuse of the platform, people and bots, then that can generate revenue for these platforms. That revenue could then be taxed and then go to supporting. I mean, in terms of the fund versus the links, this is a very good question, Taylor. I have tried myself to get journalism organizations to work together, and it's challenging. Journalism organizations don't want to join clubs, and they wouldn't want to join clubs that would have them as a member. And so how do you get a bunch of journalism organizations together to figure out how best to distribute monies that are intended for journalism consumption? This is a real conundrum. And so this bargaining approach, it sort of helps to neutralize that in a way. But it's putting the financial disincentive in the wrong place. There should be a financial disincentive on bad content, a price on information pollution. And with that, I think we could see some real progress because it's being done through financial incentives and disincentives to address this huge social problem that we have brewing, where people actually believe, for example, that if you get the COVID-19 vaccine in this country, all your hair will fall out, and other such craziness that has led to, I believe, the manipulation of provincial elections, which helps to explain some of the very poor outcomes we've seen at the provincial election level in the last few years, and will happen also with the federal election in due course. We will have a Trump moment, and it's going to be painful. And if we have an all-powerful CRTC deciding who gets what kind of access to these bargaining tables, we will have a massive democratic problem and a free speech problem on our hands. So ideas to think about.
So there's a bunch of folks that wanted to get in, and Ed, I'll get to you, and Jessica, I saw you nodding along there as well. But Rachel, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of like, who then becomes the arbiter of what is or isn't that information pollution?
I think that has to go back to journalists and civil society organizations that are public spirited and incented towards the public good. Okay. Not government.
Yeah, fair.
Not government, and not the CRTC. And not a lobby group either. It has to be done through a mix of citizens who care about content, and this is a point that Taylor, I know, has been hot on in the past, but also journalists who are oriented towards what is the best outcome for our society. And I don't yet know how to set this all up, but as I was looking through this over the last few days preparing for this talk, just thinking we're totally focused in the wrong direction here. The issue is this bad information, and it needs to be in some way taxed, because that then creates a financial disincentive for platforms to be sharing this information virally.
Jessica, do you want to get in before I get to Ed?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm loath to disagree with Rachel because history teaches me that I think she's wrong, but I'll find she's 2 years ahead of me. So nonetheless, in the present, here we are now, I'd say, first off, I'm not as worked up as some people about the CRTC. First of all, I don't think the CRTC is going to decide who gets the bargaining table and not. I think the even more mysterious QCJO process is going to decide who gets to there or not. And there has to be, this is always, policy, as somebody said earlier, is never perfect. If you aim for that, you'll never get to a policy. So the QCJO process actually is an advantage that Canada has over Australia because we've already gone through the pain of setting it up. It's not perfect. I don't want there to be an arbiter of who's in and who's out, but there always has to be an arbiter of who you how you manage the boundaries. And journalists are a little bit hypocritical about this too. When journalists wanted to have a shield law, they didn't want a shield law for everybody in the world. They wanted the shield law for journalists, and therefore they had to define who's in the shield law and who's out of the shield law. So somebody's doing that. There's a process. I'd like to see it be more transparent as well, as I think with the chair of the process. But that's point one. Point two on disinformation, taxing disinformation. I like the idea of disincentivizing bad things, but I guess I'd have to hear a lot more on how it is practical. In the way I'm seeing things and have for a number of years, sometimes we think of this as a double helix of issues. There's two strands of separate and interrelated issues. One is how will we finance journalism, and the other is what will we do about all the crap, disinformation, hate, bullying, misogyny, racism, et cetera, that's out there. And that second question is a more complex question, particularly when you get to disinformation, because you run up against charter issues. You run up against my disinformation isn't your disinformation. What is a reasonable limit on free expression? I just think it's a very difficult thing. On the other point, I don't think on the other point being, what has happened to journalism and the huge profits that the platforms have made, I don't begrudge them their better business model and their huge profits. I don't think they did anything wrong, unlike their inability to screen out bad information, hateful information. I'm not bothered that they stole our revenue. I think that's legit. but it did create a social problem. It did create a problem for democracy that we have to address without, it seems to me, laying blame on that. And finally, that takes us to the Australian model and versus tax on tech, and I suppose in Taylor's point. A tax on tech doesn't have to go into a fund that then nice people in the bureaucracy or civil society will decide, yes, your proposal's good and your proposal's bad. It could go into a formula, which is kind of what this is. It is like a tax on tech that goes into some formulaic thing for legitimate organizations. The problem is that it's not transparent and they can play favorites or not favorites. So, if, for instance, the 25% of labor costs that is part of the labor tax credit was financed, off tax on tech, that would be fine. I'm not really comfortable with people deciding that this journalistic project is good and this journalistic project isn't good. That's too close to government, too close to discretion, and really, really hard for operators who are trying to put out news not to have the predictability of the flow of money that will be coming their way. So the Australia model is imperfect. It has, and I wasn't initially in favor of the Australian model. I was in favor of a tax on tech type of approach, but one with a formula rather than a discretionary handing out of the money. The Australian model seems to be pretty close to that. There's a pretty decent consensus around it. We've seen it in other parts of the world. I think we should just build on improving it.
Jessica, let's bring you in before I get to Bill and Anya, because I'm very curious about some more international perspectives. But yeah, on the
Thank you. I think what we're all hoping for is a healthy media. A healthy and strong media can fight a lot of these problems we're facing now. We can fight disinformation. But right now, we're literally being drowned out. And you had some good stats at the top about the number of outlets that have decreased. So focusing on the conversation we can have today, I want to very briefly take you back in time to when Ed was the editor of the Globe and Mail and I was the fashion editor. And one of our biggest advertisers was the Bay. And you could see every weekend a huge Bay ad. It took up a whole page, we got a lot of money from it. And I would have to make a decision about how to cover that advertiser. But the public could see them. They were right there, right? So now we're talking about a world where David and I are both going to hopefully be getting money from some of these big tech companies. I don't know how much David's getting. I don't know if they're giving him 2 or 3 times what I'm getting. And the public isn't going to know that either, unless we have this transparency. So I would push a lot more of this on our audiences, which are very smart and can see stuff, and just make sure they have the tools, and that we have the tools to make good business decisions.
I mean, that leads perfectly to a great segue to Bill here, because I mean, given everything you've studied with the Australian model, how can we build upon transparency here and to ensure that the public is, trusting what is going on? Because of course, as I mentioned in my intro, and as everybody's mentioned here, journalism is an overall public good.
Right, and just to be clear, the Canadian law does give a little bit here. There's, if you really want to dig into it, it's the section 86, which talks about having the report, as I think Taylor mentioned, they'll talk about the total commercial value, which doesn't really tell you anything. So it's $250 million. What does that mean? And then it says information relating to the distribution of the commercial value of those agreements among eligible news businesses. Well, what does that mean? I mean, yeah. I'm not a lawyer and I don't speak Canadian fluently, so maybe I'm missing something, but it's really big,
Canadian bureaucratic speak too.
I'm sorry?
Canadian bureaucracy speak is even more
exactly. And it also says, including relative to expenditures of those businesses on the newsrooms. So, at least it mentions it. So you're already a step beyond what they were doing in Canberra a year ago. But I think it would behoove the Parliament to put a lot more meat on those bones. I would say 2 other quick things. First of all, as Jessica just pointed out, this is like having, if in fact you end up with Google and Facebook paying 20, 25, 30% of your editorial costs, it is like having a really big advertiser in town. And as you say, Jessica, at least if it's a big advertiser, everybody can see their big ads and people can make their own determinations, whether your editorial judgments being skewed by the value of those ads. Here, obviously, nobody has any idea. I will tell you, every publisher swore to me that these deals weren't making any difference in their coverage of Facebook and Google. But it's very hard to prove that. The other thing is, and this was actually voiced to me by the editor of the Cape York Weekly, which is a little weekly paper in Queensland. And the guy who's the editor writes all the stories. He actually does a terrific job. He isn't taking any money. And he said, so what's going to happen if and when, the Australian Parliament, there's a change in Parliament, somehow Facebook and Google get this law changed, or Facebook and Google just realize nobody's ever going to get designated and they just stop paying us. You kind of built up a newsroom and suddenly there's this vacuum. And that's something I think people have to kind of keep in mind, that even if you strike a deal, and most of the deals I saw in Australia were for a 3-year period, these are not in perpetuity, and governments can change, as we've seen, corporations can change, and you can envision a situation where a newsroom manager builds up a lot of staff and a lot of resources, and suddenly with the flick of the pen, it all goes away, and you have to be very prepared for that.
Look at David having his hand up and everything on the Zoom. Let's go to you first here, David.
I'll be 2 seconds. I just want to reiterate Bill and Jessica's point, but to emphasize that it's already happened in Canada. This is already taking place, and we don't know. And, Canada's one of Canada's wealthiest families, which owns a newspaper, has already signed deals with both Google and Facebook. And we don't know a thing about those deals. The newsrooms don't know a thing about the deal. The reporters in those newsrooms don't know a thing about those deals. And I just want to emphasize, the law helps to correct that imbalance. It doesn't create that imbalance. And that framing is really important when you hear some of the rhetoric taking place about this legislation now. Right. It's looking at it as if it's coming. No, it's already here.
And in fact, and if I could just build on that, in Australia, Nine and a couple of other companies did deals with Facebook and or Google even before this law passed, because just the hint of it. There were some companies that did deals very early, and they're very sorry that they did, because they actually found out what some of their compatriots were getting, and they realized that they should have held out. But I'm sure, and you're absolutely right. Some of these deals are already being done, and nobody knows what's going on.
David, if I could just ask David a question for half a second. I don't want to take the place of the moderator, but would you, when you say that, are you suggesting that those deals should be folded into the act in some way, in an act that would be more transparent, obviously, in order for it to make a difference?
They are.
Yeah, I believe they are, right?
They're subject to it. Yeah.
They're subject to exemption criteria.
Rachel, you've got your hand up here.
I just jumping off of the point that Ed raised regarding not so much, the reason I'm concerned about the CRTC's role enabling people to participate or not is that was such a huge issue of the first round of this kind of legislation for digital news startups, where it did really feel as though legacy media were benefiting and digital startups were being left out. And so there are some criteria here that is looking to be more inclusive of smaller and more innovative players in the system, but it's not entirely clear how that would then work within the CRTC. So that's why I keep flagging that point, because that was a major issue for a number of smaller players, and I think it continues to be a concern moving forward based on the polling of Press Forward members that I did before coming to this panel.
David, this has been touched upon, but I just wanted to get your take on this directly in terms of some of that imbalance when it comes to negotiating those deals that have already been done. I mean, this goes about correcting that? Does it not? Like, isn't this an improvement then, if it's sort of leveling the playing field a little bit?
Yeah, and that is how I twist myself into a pretzel in being supportive of this legislation, right? And I should say, look, like, obviously I'm self-interested here. I think a lot of the people who are speaking on this, maybe not on this panel, because there's a lot of very brilliant people and brilliant minds globally and locally. But I think when you hear certain people talking about this, everybody has a self-interest. And our self-interest is to correct that market imbalance. Absolutely, it does. I think the transparency piece, though, is important in that if it is only as some have pointed out here, a once a year thing at the end, you're going to miss that negotiation leverage that you have. And also, I do worry about the criteria being defined, as Bill mentioned when Richard Gingras defined it at the Canada 2020 event. He said it was going to be based on scale. And I deeply worry, as I share Rachel's concern about misinformation, but also, as we've seen in newsrooms, when you incentivize different things, whether it's clickbait or video, pivot to video or anything else, as soon as you say 30% of your operating budget is going to be incentivized by scale, you're doing the complete opposite of incentivizing quality journalism, which in many ways needs more time and resources and space to do. So I think clarity on that and not making scale be a priority for that is really important. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Anya, you're really nodding. If I want to bring you in before I get to Taylor.
Well, I was just thinking about how one of the frustrating things about the online world is we have to relitigate everything we already learned in the offline world. So, I've spent 15 years on various parts of the boards for the Open Society Foundation. And, when you're on a foundation, you learn about being a good donor, right? Which is that you don't make you try not to make, direct opaque deals for say, particular content, right? So I feel like the problem with Google and Facebook is they do not care about any of these conventions that we all spent years and norms building up. I was on a panel last week at Perugia with Emily Bell, and afterwards, someone from Google came up and yelled at the moderator because he thought we were too anti-Google and Facebook. So these are people that totally will throw their weight around. They are funding academics. They're lobbying like crazy. They're picking up the phone and yelling at people. And I just feel so frustrated that they're not somehow able to learn from all the norms and things that we develop. So I do think I totally agree with everybody that it's like a dangerous non-starter. And that clearly one way we're going to have to improve all of this is make sure it's not these direct payments. I agree with all of you. And last year we even tried to get copies of some of the NDAs that Taylor had been hearing about, and nobody would even show them to us, even to academics. They're just too scared. So anyway, that's why I was nodding. Sorry to go on for so long. But I do commend everybody. I think this conversation is so nuanced and interesting and thoughtful. So that's sort of what we expect from our Canadian neighbors. So thank you for that.
I'm going to get to audience questions in just a moment, but Taylor, you had your hand up right before I went to Anya. I don't know if that was an accident or.
It was not an accident. I was using the tool properly to get
Okay, good. Just checking.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment on something David said there. I think it's really important that at the moment with no code, Google can set the terms of the deal based on scale because they have power in the negotiation. Right? Looking for a nod from you, David, but you're not giving it to me. It's okay. I'll keep going then. The code I don't think specifies how that fair value should be determined.
No.
It leaves it to the negotiation. So if you've corrected for that imbalance and you as a publisher do not think that scale and distribution and size of audience is a valid measure of your value to a platform, you can negotiate on those terms for a different definition of value. And nothing would then be stopping you from banding together or collectively bargaining with other subscription-based paywalled news outlets who collectively have a different determination of your value, right? So I think that is one way maybe this gets around a bit of that. The second thing is that there's a point in the comments about algorithmic and monetization data. And this is something that feels like it wasn't carried over from the debate over the Australian code to the Canadian one. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bill and Anya here, but like, I remember there being a debate about not just bringing transparency to the monetary terms of the deal, but to the metrics and data on which the value of content is determined by platforms.
Yeah.
And if you do that, that requires someone to have access to distribution data, engagement data, algorithmic data, and monetization data on that content. And that is a very different transparency conversation. And I think Sim says that that was just beyond the bounds of what he was authorized to be able to do, but that sure, someone might want to ask that. We could, in theory, do that here, I think, right? Like some much more radical transparency over that content data and the distribution data. The final thing is on the deal renewal thing that David mentioned. It seems to me this is a real risk in the whole model, that if you're signing 1-year deals, how does that not exert editorial pressure on publishers not to report on platforms if you're re-upping that deal every year? Like that seems to me to be something that's not taken into consideration here. Okay.
I'll just address real quickly. The original legislation in Australia, as I recall it, also called, as you said, Taylor, for greater transparency around the kind of algorithms and user data that Google and Facebook use to decide to surface all kinds of things, including some things Rachel has so eloquently mentioned. And the government gave up on that as right about the time it was coming to a vote. And you might remember the Facebook took all the news off for a few days. They completely screwed it up and took off public interest sites about COVID and bushfires in the process. But and many people in Australia feel that's what the platforms really wanted. That's what they're most concerned about, because A, they felt it was impractical to have to describe changes in their algorithms every time they tweak something. And B, that's the secret sauce. That's going to Coca-Cola and saying, how much brown sugar are you putting into every case of Coke? And honestly, and I think another thing is they didn't feel the news organizations even knew what they would do with this stuff, because they, in their heart of hearts, they have a lot of disdain. Many people in the platforms have a lot of disdain for the news business. And their whole philosophy around this is basically, we're the ones who are sending you guys all these visitors, and we're not even charging you for it. We're putting all these people in your store, and you somehow can't convert those people into subscribers or an audience that advertisers want. And if you can't do it, that's not our problem. You guys need to be better at your business. And that's just the way that they see this. And so I don't think there's any kind of algorithm or data transparency built into the Canadian bill, as I recall, but I could be wrong on that. I haven't read it.
Yeah, someone's just actually corrected me in real time that actually that power is given to the CRTC when judging the terms of the deal. They can ask for algorithmic and distribution data from the platforms in order to judge the fair value of that deal. But that's, again, to Rachel's point, that's giving a fair amount of power to the CRTC.
And you're really nodding there. Did you want to get in?
I'm having a private conversation on the chat with somebody who was asking me, who's asking the panel a question about whether volunteers could clean up mis and disinformation.
Oh, I think I have that. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, so whether or not there's a role for trained Canadian volunteers to go online and basically tag misinformation for cleanup, likening it to oil spills. So yeah, let's. Anyway,
so I was answering privately, but I can also answer publicly, which is that's sort of what they tried in Europe after 2016. So the first thing that happened was the EU called in the platforms and they said, why don't we have designated flaggers and we'll accredit them. And so the idea was that you would have these designated flaggers across Europe and that they would let Google and Facebook know when there was, it sounds quaint in retrospect, when there was disinformation online. And after I think it was 6 months, the EU did a little study to evaluate what happened. And it turned out that even though they were the designated flaggers, I think Google didn't return their phone calls 70% of the time. And so then I think they went back and did another study like 6 months later, and the numbers had slightly improved. But you remember that when NetzDG happened, one of the ways in Germany that they would determine whether or not to fine, the NetzDG law said that if you repeatedly ignore requests to take down illegal content, you can be fined. And so one of the platforms, I forget which, I've written about this because I didn't discover it, somebody else did. What they did was they hid the complaints button. So that therefore their number of complaints was lower, and therefore they would be less likely to be fined for not responding to complaints. So unfortunately, I think this idea of getting public citizens and organizations involved in the fight, I think has been tried. I think it's very time intensive. I tend to feel at this point a bit exhausted, a bit what Joan Donovan has said, which is that they created this huge mess and now the rest of us are supposed to be cleaning it up for them. But I'll put a link in the chat to the article I wrote that has links to the EU studies about the not answering. And if there's other people, it's a great question. If there's other people who are interested besides Ken Sikreski, I'll put it there, but I won't speak more because probably there's other questions from other people. But thank you.
Jessica, you have your hand up.
I'm dying to talk about it because I think it's a good example of how a media outlet tries to survive in the modern world. The Walrus applied to be one of those fact checkers. If you go to our website, there's a sub page called the Walrus Fact Checking, and that was an incubator that we modeled. The Walrus fact checks all of our content, so it seemed quite natural and almost healthy that if you're a small media outlet, you would make money by fact checking the misinformation on the big platforms, and then they would pay us for it through a whole bunch of checks and balances or whatever. We were denied twice. And even though we're experts in fact checking, and it was too hard for us to meet the frequency that was required by the body. But the other thing is that the media outlets that did participate in the fact checking, it's a drop in the bucket. Like humans cannot keep up with algorithms. Even if you catch one piece, it might sit in someone's inbox while it's waiting to be approved and stuff like that. So it's really hard to say, but we're past the ideological phase of arguing about big tech, and it's time to just fix the business problems. Because, I think that any step we can make to level the playing field for any media outlet, whether it's innovation, whether it's taxation, whether it's this new revenue sharing model, is a step in the right direction toward making the media self-sustaining, which is what we really need.
Rachel, then Ed.
Yeah, just to jump off of that last point, one of the points that hasn't come up yet in this discussion is a concerning element in which it actually is on the platforms to confirm back to the CRTC that the news organization is compliant. And I find that curious. And there's also problems where platforms are there's this dynamic where, according to the legislation, the platforms will be corrected if they are not sufficiently sharing and therefore paying for news by a complaints procedure from news organizations. I think it's very naive to expect that news organizations that may be up to 30% dependent for revenue on these platforms are then going to feel empowered to put up their hands to the CRTC and complain if their news isn't getting sufficient play. And I just wanted to sort of put that point out there because it hasn't come up yet. And it really struck me when I was reading through the papers as to where did that come from and why is that even being considered? Considering how relatively disempowered news organizations are likely to be under legislation of this kind.
Ed?
Rachel, I want to react to something Jessica said, but Rachel, I think that point about the onus being put on the platforms around independence and this is I think the drafters of this legislation are working around a charter minefield in things, and a political minefield in terms of the government not having, just as you're concerned the CRTC has too much discretion, they're also concerned that they're not seen to have too much discretion. And I think they were trying, I don't know, to put that onus on the platforms to make sure that they are not, that if they are trying to exercise undue influence, that it's there to the CRTC to flag to the CRTC that they got to keep an eye on the platforms, that they're not and that they're not interfering with journalistic independence. And they would be held to account by the CRTC somehow or another. I don't know if that's a good idea or bad idea, but I think that's what they were trying to do, because you can't do that directly to a news organization and be charter proof. And I think it's there's a lot of things in the act that are very wavy in that way. There's that piece that confused, I think, a lot of folks right at the beginning that says you have to be on the list, but you can choose not to be on the list. And that got a lot of commentary, and that was trying to work around tax law. But ultimately, if you want to be eligible to be in the bargaining position, you have to be on the list. So that's but you can choose not to be on the list, and therefore you also choose not to be in bargaining. So it's a kind of, I think, indirect way to get around some constraints that were on the drafters. I guess the more important, I just want to kind of endorse what Jessica is saying, because I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that journalism's in trouble. It's in trouble in two ways, to me, more so than others. One is too few journalists, fewer and fewer journalists. And secondly, too little innovation. Those are the two things that we need to really be careful about shoring up. And so the good thing about the Australia model is it leads to more journalists. I mean, that's Bill's, what Bill shows us from Australia, organizations that have hired, many more journalists to do things. The bad things about Australia is that the platforms get to exercise too much discretion, and it happens in the shadows, and no journalist is comfortable with things that happen in the shadows, particularly if you have players that are as powerful as the platforms. So, I think we're trying to say, okay, how can we have this good part of it while them exercising less discretion? 1-year deals, if those existed, would be a terrible, terrible thing, as Taylor says. 5-year deals are going to put a chill on news organizations too. And news organizations, up for renewal in 2 years, and they are the largest advertiser in town if they're being, aggressive in their journalism towards them. So, so we really got to minimize those discretionary pieces, because they will seep into newsrooms.
David, you got your hand up, and then I wanted to throw an audience question to Taylor. You're on mute, buddy.
It hasn't happened to me in 2 years, and there it was. As always, I agree with Ed on the diagnosis of the problem, but we tend to generally come to different conclusions on the solution. I'll put on my anti-regulatory hat in saying that, journalism at the end of the day is not an industry, and it is not something that should be measured by civil servants in terms of how many people or what the head count is. Journalism is an act. And it's a craft, and we should be creating the conditions for those acts of journalism to take place, as opposed to creating the conditions for the industrial identity of journalism to survive. And I worry that when we start to prescribe solutions that are based on headcount, it shifts the paradigm a little bit. And, I don't need to get into now, but way back when I had proposed a whole bunch of ideas about how we could create or improve the conditions for acts of journalism to take place. I'll just put one out there, which is our access to information laws are some of the worst in the world in Canada. You don't hear about that in these conversations. It'd be nice if we could, make those things more accessible to people. And the other thing is, at the end of the day, if we want innovation, as the old saying goes, necessity breeds innovation. And I think that a level of restraint, while we all want the same things, I do think it's always better to err on the level of restraint on these things so that we do create that urgency and necessity for innovation. One last thing I'll say, which I talked about in Austin, Anya was there virtually a couple of weeks ago, which we haven't talked about here, is I do think we have to be very realistic about the misinformation and distrust of mainstream media taking place at the moment in Canada at this moment. And there will be, and we can guarantee that it's already happening, lots of people out there who use this as a fundraising opportunity to be against those Justin Journos, hashtag Justin Journos, and other things. And I think we need to be mindful of that and take it seriously. And one of the ways we can do that, as Jessica said earlier, we can pick on the platforms as much as we'd like, but at the end of the day, we as editors and as publishers have an onus to also be really transparent with our readers about what's happening here and communicate to them, not just in terms of how much money we're getting, why we're taking the money, but also, as you read from Dean Baquet a couple of weeks ago, explaining the process of reporting and how we do what we do and the difference between an opinion section and a news section. I just last week, I wrote a column about an investigation we did on Amazon and actually put a dollar figure on how much that cost, which I've never done before in my career. Explaining to people what it is we do and being really honest and open about it has to be coinciding with this. Otherwise, you will have political opportunists and populists taking advantage of this legislation in ways that are detrimental.
We've only got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to get to a couple more audience questions. So Taylor, I'm going to throw this one at you. In terms of, could we not require platforms to create an algorithm that searches on keywords or criterias in which are predominant within misinformation, and that those keywords would then be updated by like an impartial body? So like, let's say there's a lot of stuff going around about Justin Trudeau being Fidel Castro's son. Could we keyword Fidel Castro, let's say?
Look, I mean, this gets to the bigger, so we're talking about journalism specific policy here, but journalism specific policy sits in a much wider range of policy approaches to governing the internet and governing social platforms. And yes, we could impose that on platforms, just like the German government has imposed rules around takedowns of what can't be allowed to stay on platforms. But there is another approach of just shifting the incentives through which platforms design these very tools. And I think that's probably the direction the Canadian government's going, kind of following where the EU's gone and the UK has as well, which is, we've talked a lot about the business model here, but if you put a statutory responsibility on platforms to conduct risk assessments on the tools they deploy on society, then you switch the incentives through which they're designing those tools. So Rachel mentioned the incentives being aligned towards bad information circulating or harmful information circulating. Well, if you put a responsibility on the platforms to design their tools with potential risks and harms in mind, then that can switch that incentive, but that requires some sort of regulatory intervention to do. So I think we can talk about journalism, like just producing more journalism perhaps solves the supply problem, but it's not enough. I mean, we can't just fill our ecosystem with more journalism and expect everybody to consume it and it to reach everybody if the tools through which we're consuming information are designed with other incentives in mind to promote other kinds of content over journalism. So these things aren't mutually exclusive. Yes, we have a supply problem. That might not exist forever. Maybe journalism reemerges and there's tons of supply. You can't just pump supply into an ecosystem that doesn't value it or doesn't incentivize it and doesn't distribute it properly. And to do that, you need to engage with other policy mechanisms like duty of care or statutory responsibility models, in my view.
Bill, I wanted to get to one last quick question here before we have to wrap, but it was posed to me in the chat directly. Can't some of these big tech platforms just pack up and walk away? Canada is a very small market.
So what the Australian and the Canadian laws both say is if the platforms refuse to do deals with media companies, some arm of the government, in Australia it's the Treasurer, in Canada it would be a different body, can basically force them to either do it. If they're really obstreperous in Canada, they could face a fine of 10% of their local revenue, which would be pretty significant. Or they can go to what's called baseball arbitration, which is where the media organization and the platform both provide an estimate of what they think they should pay or owe. The arbitrator can only pick one or the other. They can't split the difference or anything. So it is, I mean, I heard the word a Damoclean sword used about 18 times during all my interviews there. I mean, it is, you know, and I've been pretty critical, and I think there's been a lot of good criticism of what's going on in both places. But as Taylor said, it is providing a funnel of dollars. And you can argue whether it's really Facebook and Google's responsibility, but I think we're in a situation where the gap in the supply of good journalism versus the demand for good journalism, or the societal need for it, is really high, and that's why I think even though I have some misgivings about not just the transparency, but the kind of underlying the philosophical idea of this, they don't override the fact that it is generating a lot of new jobs, and it's helping some of the better news organizations, or at least like The Guardian and the ABC, extend coverage into parts of Australia that we're really getting, or that we're seeing really significant deficits. So, you know, I don't want to be completely negative about it. And I think Canada's addressing some of the issues that Australia has. And I think what's really going to be interesting, we haven't mentioned it, that Wall Street Journal had a story the other day saying that in the US Congress, there's an existing bill that would allow news organizations to avoid antitrust and do the negotiation with platforms, which really doesn't mean much. But there's a proposed amendment now gaining steam in Congress that would actually provide the same kind of Damoclean sword. And if you think it's interesting seeing what Google and Facebook did in Brazil and other places, wait till this starts gaining traction in the United States. And it's not clear that it will, but if it does, you'll see Google and Facebook go all out. Google's already on the record with the US government saying, yeah, this is fine for Australia, but we don't want this in the United States. And they will go all out to make sure it doesn't get its roots in their biggest market.
Which is what happened to book publishers when they also tried to band together, remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, ages ago. Yeah.
So.